The summit. The invitation glowed on my screen like a challenge. 10-year Sundance Film Festival retrospective. Special honorees panel. RSVP required. My agent had forwarded it with a single comment. Career opportunity. Don't overthink this one, Marcus. But overthinking was exactly what I was doing as I sat in my Los Angeles apartment, staring at the email that had ambushed my otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. The Sundance retrospective meant facing the people who'd witnessed my most humiliating professional failure. And worse, the man who'd orchestrated it. You planning to stare at that email all day? My roommate, Darius, leaned against the doorframe of my home office, coffee mug in hand. As my cinematographer on most projects, he knew enough of my history to understand why this invitation had me frozen. They want me on a panel with Julian Blackwood. I said, the name's still bitter on my tongue even after a decade. Darius whistled low. The asshole who sabotaged your first film? The very same. I swiveled in my chair to face him. Why would I subject myself to that? Because you're not Marcus Washington, the kid with the failed debut anymore, Darius said, setting his mug down with purpose. You're Marcus Washington, 3-time Emmy winner, director of The Crossing, which, may I remind you, just got picked up by Netflix for a small fortune. I ran my hand over my close-cropped hair, feeling the familiar tingle of anxiety that accompanied thoughts of my early career. At 23, fresh out of NYU's film program, I'd been the talk of the independent circuit with my debut feature, South Side Requiem. The film, a raw, unflinching look at life in Chicago's South Side where I'd grown up, had been accepted as Sundance, making me one of the youngest black directors ever featured. Julian Blackwood had been my producer. Heir to a minor Hollywood dynasty, Julian had taken an interest in my project, offering funding and connections most first-time filmmakers could only dream of. What I didn't realize until too late was that Julian viewed diverse storytelling as the season's trend, my story as his ticket to being seen as progressive, and me as utterly disposable. 2 days before a Sundance premiere, I discovered Julian had re-edited my film without my knowledge, cutting crucial scenes that addressed systemic inequality and police violence, replacing my nuanced ending with something more accessible to mainstream audiences. When I confronted him, his response was burned into my memory. It's just business, Marcus. Your version was too angry. We're selling movies, not manifestos. Don't be so sensitive. My family put up half the budget. The butchered version bombed with critics who called it confused and lacking conviction. Julian quickly distanced himself, telling industry insiders that he'd tried to save an amateur's misguided vision. By the time I managed to show select critics my original cut, the damage was done. My career wasn't just stalled. It had crashed before taking off. I'd left Park City the day after our premiere, skipping all festival events, missing the chance to network with the very people who might have helped me recover. Instead, I'd spent 3 years directing commercials and music videos before slowly rebuilding my reputation with documentary shorts, then television work. Now, at 33, I had finally found my footing. The Crossing, my limited series about families separated at the border, had earned critical acclaim and a devoted audience. After a decade of hustle, I was finally being recognized for the voice I'd always tried to have. You should go, said a voice from the hallway. Zara, my production assistant and the closest thing I had to a protege, stood with her ever-present iPad clutched to her chest. Sorry, I wasn't eavesdropping. Well, I was, but only because the door was open. And why exactly should I revisit the worst professional experience of my life? I asked, though something in me already knew the answer. Zara stepped into the room, fearless as always. At 24, she reminded me of myself before Sundance. Hungry, idealistic, unstoppable. Except she was smarter than I had been. Savvier. Because, she said, Julian Blackwood is heading Apex Studios now, and they're backing like half the independent films getting distribution these days. Because your Netflix deal means you're finally in a position to make the kind of movies you've always wanted to. And because she paused, checking something on her iPad, 3 other directors from that Sundance year will be on the panel, and all of them have worked with Apex in the last 2 years. I stared at her. How do you know all that? Zara shrugged. It's my job to know things. Also, I follow film industry gossip like some people follow sports. The RSVP form had a space for career highlights since Sundance debut. I stared at it for a long time before typing. 3-time Emmy Award winner, outstanding directing, The Crossing. Founded Washington Media, specializing in socially conscious content. Executive producer of the documentary series American Margins, PBS. Recently signed overall deal with Netflix. I hesitated before adding. Original director's cut of South Side Requiem, preserved in the Museum of Modern Art's Film Collection, 2023. That last part felt important, a quiet acknowledgement that my vision had ultimately been vindicated, even if few people had seen it. The panel was scheduled for the opening night of Sundance, followed by a VIP reception at the St. Regis. I spent more money than I'd like to admit on a custom suit from a designer who'd grown up in my old Chicago neighborhood. The deep blue fabric was lined with a subtle pattern featuring the Chicago skyline, a private reminder of where I'd come from. Remember, Darius said as our small team checked into the hotel in Park City, you're not here for revenge. You're here because you belong here, right? I nodded, though the tightness in my chest suggested otherwise. Julian Blackwood hadn't changed much in 10 years. Still tall and imperious, his once blonde hair now artfully silver at the temples. His family name and connections had carried him upward despite a decidedly mediocre track record as a producer. When he spotted me at the pre-panel meet and greet, his expression flickered briefly with something like apprehension before settling into a practiced smile. Marcus Washington, he said, striding over with his hand extended. The prodigal son returns to Sundance. I shook his hand firmly, meeting his gaze. Julian, congratulations on the Apex position. Thank you, he said, visibly relieved I wasn't making a scene. I've followed your work, you know. The Crossing was powerful stuff. It was a story that needed telling. I replied evenly. Indeed. He nodded, then lowered his voice. Look, Marcus, about what happened with Requiem. It was a different time in the industry. We all made mistakes trying to navigate the market. Some mistakes more intentional than others, I said, keeping my tone light despite the anger simmering beneath. Before he could respond, we were called to take our places on the panel. The moderator, a well-respected critic who'd actually championed my original vision years ago, introduced each of us with a brief career retrospective. When she came to me, she mentioned the controversial editing decisions surrounding my debut, causing a ripple of murmurs through the audience. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus, she began, your journey from Southside Requiem to your recent Netflix deal is nothing short of remarkable. Many filmmakers might have given up after such a challenging debut experience. What kept you going? I'd prepared for this question, had a diplomatic answer ready. But sitting there, facing a room full of industry peers and emerging filmmakers who needed to hear the truth, I decided on honesty. What kept me going was knowing my voice mattered, I said. When Requiem was altered without my consent, it wasn't just my film that was compromised. It was the authentic experiences of my community, the stories of people rarely represented on screen with dignity. I couldn't walk away because those stories deserve better, and I knew I could be the one to tell them. The moderator nodded thoughtfully. And how do you feel the industry has changed in its approach to diverse voices over the past decade? It's evolved, I acknowledged. But evolution isn't the same as transformation. We're seeing more opportunities for filmmakers of color, but often with the same old power structures deciding which stories get told and how. True progress will come when we have equal representation at every level, from set production to studio boardrooms. My gaze drifted briefly to Julian, whose expression had grown increasingly strained. The conversation flowed to other panelists, covering the changing landscape of independent film financing, streaming platforms' influence, and the future of theatrical distribution. Throughout it all, I felt a strange calm replacing my initial anxiety. I belonged in this conversation now, not as a cautionary tale, but as a success story, someone who had persevered despite the Julian Blackwoods of the world. When a moderator opened the floor to audience questions, a young film student approached the microphone. "This is for Mr. Washington," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "I'm a first year at USC, and your work is a huge inspiration, especially for students of color like me. What advice would you give about protecting your artistic vision when working with powerful producers or studios?" I felt Julian's eyes on me, practically radiating tension. The easy path would be a generic answer about collaboration and compromise. Instead, I leaned forward. "Get everything in writing," I said, prompting scattered laughter. "But more importantly, build your community. Find collaborators who respect your vision and share your values." I made a mistake early on, thinking I needed validation from traditional power structures. I gestured subtly toward Julian. What I really needed was to trust myself and connect with the audience my stories were meant for. I paused, then added, "And remember that failure isn't final." My first film was taken from me, recut against my wishes, and released in a form I couldn't stand behind. That could have been the end of my story. Instead, it became chapter 1. The young filmmaker nodded earnestly, scribbling notes. From the corner of my eye, I could see Zara in the audience giving me a subtle thumbs up. At the reception afterward, I found myself surrounded by people I'd once dreamed of meeting: executives, distributors, established directors. Some apologized for not reaching out after the Requiem debacle. Others pitched collaboration ideas. A development executive from a major studio slipped me her card, mentioning a biographical script about Miles Davis they'd been struggling to find the right director for. "Your work has such musicality to it," she said. "We'd love to talk when you're back in LA." Around midnight, as the reception was winding down, Julian approached me at the bar, slightly drunk and without his usual entourage. "You've done well for yourself," he said, signaling the bartender for another scotch. "Better than most of the directors from that year." "No thanks to you," I replied, but without heat. The anger that had fueled me for years had mellowed into something more like pity. Julian stared into his drink. My father told me once that this business was about controlling the narrative. That's what he did for 40 years at Paramount. I thought I was just following the playbook. "My story wasn't yours to control," I said simply. "No," he agreed, surprising me. "It wasn't. For what it's worth, I watched your director's cut, the one at MoMA. You were right about the ending." I studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. "Are you apologizing, Julian?" He laughed humorlessly. "Would it matter if I was?" "Probably not," I admitted. "But it might matter to the next young filmmaker you work with." Julian nodded slowly, seeming to actually consider my words. "Apex is backing a new initiative for first-time directors," he said after a moment. "Focused on underrepresented voices. Full creative control guaranteed contractually. You'd be an ideal advisor if you're interested." I nearly choked on my drink. "You're offering me a job?" "More like a consulting role," he clarified. "The industry's changing, Marcus. I'm trying to change with it." I set my glass down, studying him. Was this a genuine attempt at redemption or just another business calculation? Perhaps both. Email me the details, I said finally. I can't promise anything, but I'll look it over. Later, as Darius, Zara and I walked back to our hotel through the snowy streets of Park City, Zara asked, "Did it go how you expected?" I thought about Julian's half apology, about the young filmmaker's question, about the business cards now filling my wallet, each representing an opportunity I'd once thought permanently closed to me. No, I answered honestly. It was, I don't know, more complicated. How so? Darius asked. I came here thinking this was about closure, about finally standing up to the man who tried to erase my voice. I explained. But that's not what happened at all. What happened instead? Zara pressed. I stopped walking, looking back at the lights of Main Street where the festival was in full swing. Filmmakers pitching dreams, deals being made, careers launching and failing in equal measure. Somewhere in that beautiful chaos was the 23-year-old version of me, still believing his voice didn't matter. I realized I'm not defined by what Julian did to me, I said finally. I've been carrying that moment around for 10 years, letting it shape every decision. But the truth is, I made it despite him, not because of him. So no dramatic confrontation? Darius sounded almost disappointed. I laughed. Life isn't always like the movies, man. Speaking of movies, Zara interjected, checking her phone. That executive from Paramount just emailed. She wants to meet tomorrow about the Miles Davis project. Tomorrow? We're flying back tomorrow, I reminded her. She gave me a look that said I was missing the obvious. We can change the tickets. This is Miles Davis we're talking about. I shook my head, smiling. Change the tickets. As we continued toward the hotel, snow crunching beneath our boots, I felt something shift inside me. A weight lifting, a door opening. The humiliated young director had finally found his peace, not through vengeance or even vindication, but through the simple, powerful act of reclaiming his own story. My phone buzzed. A text from Julian meant what I said about the initiative. Your perspective would be valuable. I put my phone away without responding. That was a decision for tomorrow. Tonight belonged to the future, not the past. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible content.